Okay. Right. So let's just first start with a bit about stigma itself, and then I will move stigma in media and then to destigmatizing strategies. I'm not sure if I can monitor the chat at the same time as looking at these slides. I'll try.
I'll do the kind of grouping of the questions, and if there's anything you want me,
perfect.
If there's like a big shout out or something, I'll pop in.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, so stigma is a direct result of stereotyping, occurs when a particular outgroup is rejected, devalued, ignored, or oppressed because of associated attributes which negatively affects a variety of dimensions of outgroup members' lives, for example, social status, mobility, physical or social mobility, that is, economic status, well-being, self-esteem, self-perception, group identification, motivation, social interaction, and of course, achievement-based performance, which has been seen in job interviews, for instance. Erving Goffman distills stigma to the discrepancy between virtual social identity, which is a stereotyped, undesirable characterization of outgroup members, and actual social identity, which is a more nuanced, individuated characterization of other people. So stigma entails negative outcomes for outgroups based on a negative bias in the in-group, and that can be, or is rather, informed by stereotypes which can be negative or positive, but I will come to that. So if we look at the process of stigma, the first stage of stigma is the distinguishing and labeling of differences, through which in-group, out-group differences are made salient, thus othering the outgroup. The second stage is the association of negative attributes, which operates through stereotyping that leads to the said stigmatizing attitudes. And the third stage is an intergroup separation that divides us from them, and it manifests the boundary set up in stage one in real life through physical and social isolation or exclusion. The last stage is the status loss and discrimination, whereby in-group members exhibit harmful behavior and social conditions such as policies that disadvantage the outgroup. So in relation to media, stage 1 and 2 are the ones informed by narrative and aesthetic representations, which content producers like filmmakers are responsible for. So especially popular storytelling formulas that emphasize difference are responsible for the generation of group binaries. For instance, if a narrative centers on disability and a non-disabled viewer, if a narrative centers on disability and disability is made salient, then a non-disabled viewer would self-identify as a member of the in-group, which will be non-disabled, whilst a disabled screen character would by default belong to the outgroup, i.e. being the other. So this in-group, out-group dynamic is totally dependent on contextual factors and salience, and media can influence this salience to either the disadvantage of outgroups when they stereotype outgroups, or to the advantage of outgroups where they break stereotypes or use non-stigmatization techniques, which I will talk about later. The second stage of stereotyping is interesting because Fallon and Link only refer to negative attributes, but there are also positive attributes, and the resulting positive stereotypes can lead to stigmatizing attitudes. One example is the supercrip stereotype, which is applied to disabled people when we see them in overly positive attributes, but at the same time, this creates negative attitudes in the outgroup. So I'm sure you've seen this before with disabled sports people or athletes, especially during the Paralympics. And this creates low expectations towards the disability community in general, because these so-called supercrips are seen as an exception. Okay, so if we look at the case study of obesity, in Western media, programs such as Extreme Weight Loss or Dickes Deutschland, translated Fat Germany, and It's Your Fault, I'm Fat. In these programs, depicted implications of obesity include severe health issues, mobility issues, mental health issues, unemployment, bullying, low self-esteem, and undesirability when searching for relationship partners. So in narrative, but also in the aesthetic discourse, there's a centralization on the physical attributes that are made saliently different to the in-group. So basically it creates a binary between us, non-obese viewers, versus them, obese screen characters. So PLOS represents the journey of losing weight, and aesthetic choices overemphasize the different body, especially the body struggling to move and perform everyday tasks. So in essence, these documentaries are not only facilitating the non-obese in-group's viewer categorization process, which shoehorns screen characters into a very coherent obese outgroup, but they also activate related stereotypes by attributing dispositions that are socially and morally frowned upon, such as laziness, ignorance, and addictive tendencies to binge eat. Of course, these topics are important as they have the potential to promote healthy lifestyles in general or avoid excessive obesity. So when you have programs about healthcare, nutrition, mental health, these themes are important, but the problem is that obese people are depicted predominantly within this type of coherently stigmatizing discourses. There's no spectrum, there's no diversity in the representations. So if we look at Cady and Cady's stereotype content model, it explains well the link between stigmatizing stereotypes, attitudes, and discrimination in relation to social behavior. So from an evolutionary perspective, it argues that in-groups evaluate out-groups based on their potential in the social cooperation with marshalling necessary resources for survival. So on the y-axis, we have warmth, which refers to the other's perceived intent in social interactions, and includes traits like morality, trustworthiness, sincerity, kindness, and friendliness. So warmth could be seen as likability, i.e. positive attitude, the higher you go, of course, on the axis. On the x-axis, we have competence, which concerns the other's ability to realize their intentions, including inferred traits like efficacy, skills, creativity, confidence, and intelligence. So the demographics depicted here are all based on a cross-sectional survey in the US, i.e. of the general US population, but they're quite similar, especially in terms of disability, are quite similar across countries, because this was done across countries, and disability almost always falls into the same quadrant. So we have here 4 quadrants, and for example, welfare recipients are generally seen by Americans as low in competence and low in warmth. Elderly are seen as low in competence but high in warmth. Rich people are seen as high in competence but low in warmth. And of course, it comes to no surprise that social groups that represent the typical or prototypical majority American, i.e. middle class Christians, are perceived as high in competence and high in warmth, which is why they are in the upper right quadrant of high warmth and high competence. So as an extension to this model, the bias map considers attitudinal effects triggered by stereotype-based warmth competence configurations, as well as resulting behavioral tendencies. So for example, pity constitutes in low competence by high warmth. And this produces a very paternalistic prejudice that is held towards, for example, disabled people, but also obese people. Contempt and envy are other 2 negatively balanced attitudes. The only positive attitude is admiration, which exists towards in-groups, reference groups, or groups that are very similar to in-groups because of their shared goals and the perceived competence to achieve these goals. So if we transpose, if we transpose the obesity example into this model, we can see that the in-group of non-obese people located in the admiration quadrant, in media discourses, these are either depicted family members, friends, work colleagues who are visibly not obese, or of course the non-obese audience, in-group audience, or it is the obese person after having lost weight, they move from one quadrant to the other quadrant. So on the left side, we have the out-group, which is seen as low in competence, and the polar opposite between in-group and out-group is heightened primarily through emphasizing the salient bodily differences, which is what I said earlier, that the stigmatizing feature of obesity is central to the narrative, it's made salient. The salient stigmatizing difference and the related discourse feature prominently not only in the film text, but also paratexts. So most of the show's titles include the words fat and weight, and all promotional texts such as trailers and graphics overemphasize corpulent body sizes. The factor of perceived controllability is essential in attitude formation. Now, what does this mean? Characters are portrayed as either being directly responsible for their weight when it comes to obesity, or as being responsible for not wanting or knowing how to reduce weight. So even the narrative emphasis on every lost kilo during diets or exercise regimes suggests controllability and may lower warmth if characters relapse into old habits. So there's a tendency for non-obese in-group members to consider obesity as self-inflicted and thus feeling contempt towards the out-group, which is emphasized here by, by this quadrant. Yeah, so low warmth, low competence is perceived if the obesity is seen as being controllable. And this, of course, has been linked to cyberbullying. So studies have shown that the higher controllability is perceived of obese people, the more cyberbullying exists towards this group. So only if the reasons for obesity are known and deemed uncontrollable, such as diabetes or hormonal or environmental reasons, warmth will grow and contempt will shift to pity. So we go into this quadrant. But uncontrollable factors rarely include dispositions and tend to be based on situations. So the problem is that in the absence of reasons for the obesity, an average in-group viewer, i.e. a non-obese viewer, would probably infer stereotypical dispositions as responsible for being obese, rather than more complex situational factors. So in other words, if we don't have the information why the person is obese, we automatically apply controllability and stereotypical dispositions such as laziness or other factors that can be controlled by them, and we end up in this quadrant. So when we talk about stigma reduction, the prerequisite of stigma reduction constitutes in reducing the social distance between in-group viewer and out-group screen character. Social distance induces a feeling of alienation towards the other and is a mental construct by in-group members, regardless of the actual physical distance. So cognitive and affective responses activated by stereotypes enlarge social distance, and in reverse, social distance facilitates stereotype activation and maintains stigma. Now, social distance operates on three levels. First, it increases outgroup homogeneity by rendering the outgroup more blurred, schematic, abstract, and decontextualized. If we look at the obesity example above, most of these shows I mentioned choose characters with the most possibly body weights in order to reinforce in-group outgroup difference and create outgroup homogeneity. In very stigmatizing terms, producers deem the fatter the better. They also decontextualize the characters by rarely focusing on situational factors for the weights, and most importantly, never focusing on aspects in their lives that are unrelated to obesity. The stigmatizing condition basically must be at the center of the narrative discourse, and any wider contextualization would dilute this homogeneous discourse and may dehomogenize the outgroup, which is why it's not done. The second level, distance decreases the motivation for the in-group to have any direct contact with the out-group. So social boundaries maintained in order to reduce identity threats, as you can see on this picture here. Of course, the lack of direct contact in audiovisual mediations reinforces the distance, but the motivation is also lowered by the largely negative attitudes in-group viewers form or have confirmed. So in the obesity example, the low competence representations elicit predominantly the negative attitudes or emotions of pity or contempt. And thirdly, distance decreases the in-group's motivation to acquire more knowledge that may inhibit stereotype activation. And this lack of interest is due to the assumed plausibility and accuracy of stereotypes. So if we look especially at documentary film narratives, they contribute quite a lot to stereotypes because they appear to be all explaining and based on authentic lives. So for instance, the obesity documentaries focus on everyday life and are perceived as factually accurate, unless of course you have reasons to disbelieve the source. But usually if we don't have any reason to disbelieve the source, we believe what documentaries are representing. And also the plots are so coherent and plausible in terms of the personality traits and the lifestyles, including self-stigmatizing attitudes from characters themselves, where you see, for example, people looking into their mirrors and saying, oh, I look disgusting, or I'm too fat. So these narratives are so plausibly constructed that there's simply no desire in the viewer to find out more about these characters. Paradoxically, this impression of accurate knowledge stands quite in direct opposition to the highly skewed, decontextualized, and incomplete attention to the stigmatizing condition. But of course, the viewer is not aware of that because, as we know, stereotypes are very schematic and very simplified, but the viewer is not aware of this simplification because most of the time we deploy stereotypes automatically, not consciously. The social distance becomes interlocked with epistemological distance, i.e. you are distant to this group, you don't want to know more of this group or beyond the stereotypes that you are given. So the major concept to reduce social distance and thus stigma is the contact hypothesis. Originally formulated in the 1950s by Gordon Allport, it aims to reduce intergroup boundaries through bringing in-groups and out-groups together via shared experience. On a cognitive level, this has the potential to increase the in-group's knowledge about the out-group, and it reconfigures stereotypical categorizations. On an affective level, it can reduce anxiety and identity threat, and it can increase empathy or at least generate empathic reactions. The conditions for such a contact are sustained direct interaction, i.e. long-term interaction between the groups, cooperation towards common goals, which includes the sense of common interests, common interest, and the cooperation towards common goals also provides the opportunity to gain more knowledge about the other group and to understand their perspective. So group members are thus motivated to cross the intergroup boundary and interact because identity threat and contact anxiety are mitigated because of that context of cooperation. And then fear for the other can be replaced through empathic concern for the other. Person-to-person contact across groups can also lead to outgroup members being perceived as either individual exemplars or as a multitude of different sub-outgroups, which renders the outgroups less schematic, less abstract, and less homogeneous. So basically we have a higher degree of outgroup variability, which also precludes the activation of stereotypes. So essentially such an intergroup contact contributes to the discovery of intergroup similarities on both sides, through which outgroup members are at least partly seen less through stereotypical categories. And I forgot two of the conditions. Another one is sense of equal status, where one group doesn't feel superior to the other group, and institutional sanctioning. So the institutions that define the context, like the media institutions, need to sanction this context scenario. If it doesn't, if there are policies or regulations that actively inhibits the contact, then it will not lead to a successful outcome. There are two desired outcomes of the context scenario if we apply to media representations that enable in-group viewers to have virtual contact with out-group screen characters. So if we transpose the context hypothesis to spectatorship, then we talk about the contact between viewer and screen character. Edward Schiappa calls this the parasocial contact. So one of these outcomes is the generation of empathic reactions towards the other, which addresses the conditions of common interest and equal status. The essential objective of inhibiting stereotype activation is basically to reduce the fundamental attribution error. Now, what does this mean? This error makes observers attribute dispositions, i.e. personality traits, rather than situational circumstances to the observed behavior of others. So basically, when you observe someone in terms of how they behave, how they are dressed, their skin tone, and so their body shape and so forth, you make assumptions about how character traits are related to that. Rarely you make assumptions about how the situation informs these demographics. So this means that in the absence of individuated knowledge about an outgroup member, we tend to access stereotypical role schemas for attributing very simplified and generalized dispositions. However, if we have empathic reactions towards these characters, this allows the observer to form a more complete, more rounded, more accurate or authentic attribution of the other's behavior, which includes dispositional, but also situational factors. So basically, we get to understand the behavior of others more authentically as a combination between individual character traits, collective character traits, and situational circumstances, which significantly reduces our reliance on stereotypical role schemas. And this is why Ed Tan, a cognitive film theorist, defines empathy as all the cognitive and affective operations in the viewer that lead to a more complete understanding of the situational meaning for the characters. It's about the situational meaning. Based on this, Gordon Moskowitz argues that the situation is the person. Yeah, so highlighting the significance and particularity of a situation in relation to the character on screen increases the possibility for empathic reactions and decreases the potential of stereotypical categorization. The character becomes more rounded and more individuated. One of the most efficient ways to achieve these kind of empathic reactions for screen characters is seeing them interacting with materiality. So, for example, objects and spaces in very particular situations. And this highly increases the scope for perspective taking on the audience's part, leading to empathic reactions, for example, affective mimicry. Let's have a look at an example. So in this documentary, Buena Vista Social Club by Wim Wenders, Cuban singer Ibrahim Ferrer represents to the camera a little altar with a statue of the biblical figure of the beggar Lazarus at his home. Ibrahim Ferrer shows and describes all the offerings he regularly makes to this figure, including lit candles, flowers, a small bowl with honey, a perfume bottle, small glass of rum, and a meringue his wife frequently makes. So in this action interview, Ferrer does not just talk about something abstract, but physically interacts with objects within a particular location, which embodies his personal perspective in relation to the particular situation of this ritual of religious offering. This reveals him as a calm, humble, religious, approachable, and playful person. He becomes quite a rounded character. His engaged body language and enthusiastic voice also reveal his affections towards this figure. The mentioning of a religious icon, the ram, the merengue, also provide a cultural perspective, whilst insights into his domestic space and artifacts provide a socioeconomic perspective in the viewer. So none of these dispositional and situational attributes relate to music or his profession, which are the actual topic of the film. And the character becomes less schematic and more rounded, i.e. less categorical. He's not reduced basically to either a singer or a Cuban or an old person, but he has all these different identities merged. So all this psychological perspective taking is not just prompted by material interactions in front of the camera, but also by how that interaction is translated through audiovisual means, especially cinematography and editing. And these actually spatio-temporally place the viewer into Ferrer's perspective in terms of the medium shot and the close-ups. The scene uses an editing style called observation continuity, which closely follows his bodily interactions with the artifacts and doesn't cut to other spaces. So it feels very much like you as the viewer are immersed in this scene and are like a passive observer. So in summary, for a white, Western, middle-aged, non-musician viewer, the social distance to Ferrer is significantly reduced. The other desired outcome of the context scenario is stereotype inconsistency, and one way to achieve this in media representations is through surprising category combinations. Now, what does this mean? When we observe a person, we categorize them to one or multiple categories that are made salient in a specific context. And sometimes this is called intersectionality. The interaction of multiple salient categories can lead to more stigma if these categories are used in an additive manner, but they can also reduce stigma if they're used in surprising combinations. So for example, if we observe the combination of two or more equally salient categories that is unique and surprising to us as the in-group, the attributed dispositions are particular to that combination and not typically applied to either category in isolation. In other words, the dispositions that would typically be attributed to each category separately clash with each other to the extent that a new disposition needs to be inferred for this surprising combination. For instance, to a bricklayer, I'm talking now in very stereotypical terms, to a bricklayer, an academic may evoke the stereotypical disposition of being snobbish, whilst to an academic, a bricklayer may evoke the stereotypical disposition of being vulgar. However, an academic bricklayer would result in a mismatch of these inferred dispositions in the observer, leading to the necessity of generating a new disposition that is not based on existing role schemas, but rather on a new spontaneous evaluation. And this means that the activation of stereotypes through each respective category, whether bricklayer or academic, is inhibited because we have this new combination. Now, to achieve a surprising outcome, the category groups need to be related to each other in terms of disappointing expectations in observers. So for instance, gender and profession can provide the surprising combination of a female mechanic because most mechanics are men. And this is there are certain surprise combinations that can still activate stereotypes though. Yeah, so if one category stereotypically appears to contradict the other in terms of physical, psychological, social ability, it may well lead, for example, to the super creep stereotype, like an amputee pilot or a wheelchair dancer. So just because we have a surprise effect doesn't mean that automatically we have the inhibition of stereotypes. It needs to be properly evaluated in terms of what stereotypes exist for a particular group. So not all surprising combinations lead to stereotype inhibition. An interesting and rather complex example is this travel documentary miniseries on BBC Two, Africa with Adepitan, which explores different African countries and cultures, and it features Ade Adepitan, a Black British disabled athlete and TV personality, as the presenter. So Adepitan clearly presents each episode through his physical presence and his voiceover, leading and explaining the journey, underpinned by maps and traveling shots from his perspective. And his most salient categories are British, Black, disabled, traveler, and of course, presenter. And these categories are made salient depending on the particular situation. So sometimes his disability is more salient because we can see his wheelchair and he makes occasional references to his mobility. Sometimes it's more about the travel and the presenter. So if we talk about the interaction of disability and the traveling presenter, because this is the surprising combination I'm after here, this combination appears somewhat incompatible because the in-group viewer stereotypically attributes mobility to the traveler and immobility to the disabled person. So the in-group, i.e. the non-disabled and non-presenting viewer, cannot easily associate the stigma of incapability and inferiority attached to disabled people with the stereotype of authority and in control and mobility of usual TV presenters. And maybe because of this stigma, it is very rare and thus surprising to see disabled presenters in travel documentaries. But of course, as previously mentioned, this particular combination can promote the supergroup stereotype because he's traveling despite being in a wheelchair. However, the series employs a variety of additional strategies to reduce the potential of this stereotype. And these includes, for example, a lot of material interactions where we see him interacting with people, with objects, particular situations, and these generate empathic reactions in the viewer. But also we have the strategy of recategorization through which his Britishness is highlighted. And that's a very important factor because his Britishness is a shared identity between him and the British non-disabled, non-presenting viewer. So surprising combinations is only one method of creating a successful context scenario, and there are many more based on the interaction of multiple categories like cross-categorization, decategorization, but we don't have the scope to and time to go through this, so I will leave it there for now, and maybe we can open the floor for questions, but thank you very much for listening.